We do want to bring in another professor from North Central College, Professor William Muck, who has also lent us his voice and expertise over the past several weeks. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Good to be here.
Thanks. I want to first ask you, obviously you teach political science and foreign policy. So, what would you say would be the worldview of what happened today?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because the world is a very different dynamic than in U.S. internal politics, and I think there's a weariness with Donald Trump around the world, right? I think there's a lack of understanding about what the appeal in the United States is, and again, there's populism and those kind of candidates all over the world, but I think there's looking at the United States as a bit of a spectacle. I think looking at the United States as a democracy that doesn't always run very pretty, I guess to say. So I think there's the world is looking at the United States and kind of wondering what's going on. But I think the fact that the legal system was capable of holding a former president guilty is also a good thing that shows that even in the oftentimes dysfunctional U.S. democracy, they can still have a legal case and still let that process play out.
As I do that, much of the world gets its news through sound bites, and Donald Trump is one of the kings of the soundbite, and he's been saying from the beginning that this is political theater and that this is orchestrated by Joe Biden. This, we know, is a state case, that the DA there, Alvin Bragg, brought this case against Donald Trump independently of Joe Biden. But do you think people care about the details here? Are the details lost on the average American?
I think they are, right? I think we have our teams, right? And if you're team Trump, you have a certain understanding of this. If you're anti-Trump, you have a certain understanding of the decision today. And I think there's not going to be a lot of changing views based on the result here. Now, the only question I have, and I think Dr. Caliendo was spot on in his analysis, is are there some individuals who are uncomfortable re-electing a president who's been found guilty of a felony, right? So you wonder, somebody who, maybe would support Donald Trump, but just feels a little bit uncomfortable about that, right? So you wonder, what is the number of those individuals? And if it's significant, it could impact the election. If it proves not to be significant, if people say, I'm all Trump all the time, doesn't matter what he does in terms of the legal system, then I think, Biden is actually in trouble right now, because the polling is very much against Biden at this moment.
So, Professor Muck, this is Paris Schutz here at Fox 32. If you're the Biden campaign, what's your strategy? Is it to go all in on Trump as a convicted felon, or to stay away and focus on abortion and immigration and the other hot-button issues of the day?
I think you do all of the above, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if there's greater attention focused on Donald Trump, right? So what the Biden campaign has been trying to do over the last couple of months is remind everybody of Donald Trump, remind them of what his presidency was like, remind them of his flaws. So I think there'll be some of that. Biden also always comes back to democracy and the rule of law. So I wouldn't be surprised if he talks about the importance of that. But at the end of the day, as you noted, there are certain issues that they're really focusing on right now, and I think abortion is one of them. So I think they're going to do all of those things at once. I think if they had their pick, I think they would really love this election to be about Donald Trump. That proved successful last time, and they're having trouble getting traction on that. But I think that's where their attention wants to be, and remind people of Donald Trump and what those 4 years were like.
So, as you know, the judge has options: put him in prison or not, give him probation. What do you think would happen? Obviously, a lot of people are thinking it'll just be probation.
Yeah, I think that's probably what we're looking at. It would be a big deal. I mean, Donald Trump doesn't have a long criminal record, and it's also the president of the United States. So, Trump makes a lot of comments about how he doesn't get a fair shake, but the reality is that as president, he gets breaks that the average individual wouldn't. And it would be a nightmare to actually have a former president of the United States in prison or even under home arrest. So I think it's likely to be probation or something more minor like that, but that will still have an impact on the campaign, right? It'll have logistical impact where he's got to think about, how do I get from state to state? Is there a parole officer? Does he have to get permission to travel? So there are a lot of sort of logistical challenges that could arise. And then there's also sort of the broader philosophical challenge of, how does he confront this new narrative that he's a convicted felon? How does he spin it? So I think the campaign has got to think about both of those things as they move forward.
Professor, if we look at exit polling from 2020, we know that Joe Biden galvanized many young voters. He drew them to the polls. It was a big difference for him in overtaking Donald Trump and winning the White House. We've seen in recent months a bit of a turnaround there. Not only is Joe Biden bleeding younger voters, he's losing people of color. Do you think, again, today's outcome changes that narrative in any way, shape, or form?
I'm not sure it does, correct? As we think about those two different groups, talking about young people, they're focused on Gaza, right? That tends to be the issue that is driving their views. And so I'm not sure whether a Trump conviction is going to change that perception. And hey, as you also talk about some of the demographic change among Black and Hispanic voters, right? That also is going against him. And I'm not sure this news is going to change that. As we look at the broad data about what this next presidential election is going to be about, we're starting to see patterns that this is a change election, that voters, especially young voters, but actually voters across all spectrums, want change. And then the question is Joe Biden that kind of candidate? And I think, Donald Trump certainly is in a lot of ways, not all of them good. But Donald Trump might actually benefit from the fact that this is a change election, and it may overwhelm some of the negative coverage from the trial itself.
So let me ask you this, because Dr. Caliendo talked about it. Do you believe that President Biden should comment on this, as part of the election, or leave it alone like he thought he should probably do?
Yeah, I think in the short term, it's right to leave that alone and not talk about it, right? I wouldn't be surprised whether Trump speaks about it. He might even give some comments tonight or tomorrow, some additional comments. I think Biden has to be a bit more graceful in how he handles it, right? He wants to create this dynamic to say, Trump is the dangerous, dysfunctional, felon, and I'm the adult in the room. So how you handle it has to be done very, very carefully, emphasizing the elements of democracy and the rule of law and the importance of the criminal justice system, right? And those are things that can be done slower and not right away. So if I was advising the Biden campaign, I would say, hey, let Trump drive the news for the next couple days, because it's not going to be particularly good coverage for him.
Okay, quick follow-up to that then. We know June 27th they're going to have the first of what is right now only 2 scheduled debates. It's a very important debate, really, for Joe Biden, you would argue, more so than Donald Trump. Would this be a topic that is radioactive to Joe Biden in that format?
Well, that's a good question, right? I think he's got to do so in a way that draws a contrast between him and Donald Trump, right? That's what those debates are really about, is sort of simplifying things, because people don't care about the policy nuances. It's really about which is my guy. And, in many ways, Trump connects with a lot of people, right? So they really connect him as the person, not as the policy. So Joe Biden has to find a way to do that. And maybe he can see this as, use this issue as a wedge to say that, hey, I'm the guy that believes in law and order. I'm the guy that isn't a convicted felon. But I don't know whether that will get him a lot of traction in the debate, and whether it's something to go after, or whether it's better to focus on some of these other issues like abortion, where they know there's broad support.
It sounds like, Biden has commented just a bit on it, saying that Donald Trump is not above the law. He mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law for his own personal gain. But he said today's verdict does not change the fact that the American people face a simple reality. So he's made some comments about it, but maybe after that he'll just, as you said, let Trump drive the news.
It's kind of interesting.
Absolutely right. It's a really interesting place. And in some ways, Biden is in a more difficult position trying to comment on this than Trump, because we know the sort of narrative that Trump is going to push and how he's going to talk about it and the way in which he'll turn himself into a victim and all of that. It's a little bit more difficult for Biden to do that and not come across in a negative way.
I was just going to add in, it's not just Trump, but it's the entire Republican Party, except for folks like Pat Brady, who were never really on the Trump train, basically casting their lot with Donald Trump and attacking the justice system, attacking the legal system. When the Mueller report came out, they attacked the FBI, they attacked the Department of Justice. This is the party of law and order. I'm wondering, Professor, what you think the effect on the country is when you have not just the standard bearer of the party, but the majority of the party now casting their lot with one person against the system, against the rule of law, against the legal system.
This is a really, really important point, right? Because there is a cost to the attacks that Trump levels on the legal system, right? He is suggesting that it's corrupt, that judges are corrupt, that the whole DOJ is partisan, right? And that has an effect, and it has an effect all the way up to the Supreme Court in terms of how people perceive this. Democracies are oftentimes undermined from within and by the actual members of that democracy, right? So you have candidates using the tools of democracy to undermine democracy. And I think that describes oftentimes what Donald Trump does. He uses his power, his tools, to undermine some of our core democratic institutions. So there absolutely is a cost there, and I think it's something that doesn't get enough conversation.
And I'm just curious, and I don't know if we've talked about this, Professor, over these past few months. Do you envision a Trump presidency where one of his first orders of business is he tosses out the remaining cases against himself?
Yeah, this is a really important legal question, right? So let's say, it's unlike the two other federal cases are going to be tried before he potentially could win the presidency. Yeah, he could direct his Department of Justice to do so. Now, historically, there's been a wall between the Attorney General and the president, at least since Nixon, where the president doesn't influence that process. But Donald Trump and some of his supporters have suggested that he doesn't believe that should be the case anymore. So I think we have to take him at his word and suggest that if he does get elected, that he would absolutely use the power that he has to push those cases to go away. Now, this may work its way to the Supreme Court. They may have to intervene to see, does the president have the power to do so? Does the president have the power to pardon himself? I think if Trump is reelected, we're going to be facing a whole host of really unique constitutional questions that are likely only going to be answered by the Supreme Court.